I could practically hear the grinding of her teeth when she pulled away from me that morning in the kitchen. It was subtle, but the tightness in Rachel's jaw said everything. She didn't even glance my way, just busied herself with stacking dishes like I wasn't even there. I stood there, watching her, trying to make sense of why she'd been avoiding me for months. Ever since I gave up construction, my back still screams from that damn fall. Our marriage had turned ice cold. One day, she'd be warm, asking me about my fishing trips in Wyoming's crystal-clear rivers. The next, she'd be throwing sharp little digs about how I should spend my time doing something more useful. But that morning, something felt different. She barely slept in our bed anymore, always blaming it on stress from the loan payments for her new clinic. But as she slammed plates around, I knew this wasn't just stress. It was something else, something simmering just under the surface, ready to boil over. I tried to ease the tension, maybe open up a conversation. She whipped around, eyes flashing, and snapped, "Don't just stand there like a lost puppy. Make yourself useful for once." Her voice cut deeper than any broken bone I'd ever suffered on a job site. It made the old scars on my back ache, a bitter reminder of the years I'd spent breaking myself to provide for us. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and stormed out the door, to work. On a Saturday. Dentists around here don't take weekend shifts, so that alone set off alarm bells in my head. I'd gotten used to her late nights, sure, but heading out before dawn on a Saturday? My gut twisted. Something felt off. After she left, I spotted her phone charger still plugged in beside the couch. Rachel never forgets things like that. She guards her phone like it holds government secrets, so leaving the charger behind wasn't just some slip-up. I tried to shake it off, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't loosen. I wandered into the garage, hoping to clear my head by tinkering with my fishing gear, but my thoughts kept circling back to that hard, unreadable look in her eyes. Hours later, restless and needing to get out of that suffocating house, I ended up at a hardware store. I told myself I needed some new tools, but really, I just couldn't stand being there alone with nothing but the silence pressing in. While waiting in line, I overheard a woman behind me talking about her marriage falling apart, how her husband had grown distant, how she found out he'd been leading a double life right under her nose. My pulse pounded. My thoughts snapped back to Rachel. The sudden coldness, the rejection, 8 months of it. The shifts in her mood, the flimsy excuses, the widening gap between us. The pieces started falling into place, and a sick feeling settled deep in my gut. When I got home, the house was eerily still. Rachel still wasn't back. Hours passed, no call, no text. I thought about reaching out, but I couldn't stomach another round of biting sarcasm, so I just sat there, flipping through TV channels without actually watching anything. Then my eyes landed on the calendar pinned to the fridge. It was flipped open to a page about prenatal appointments. My breath caught in my throat. We hadn't been close in, well, it had been a long time. Pregnant? How? And why the hell hadn't she told me? Sleep was out of the question. I sat there, staring at the front door, waiting for her to come home and give me some kind of explanation. Midnight passed. Then 2 a.m. Finally, just as the first hints of dawn crept through the blinds, she walked in. A faint trace of cologne, not mine, clung to her clothes. When I asked about the calendar, she let out a cold, humorless laugh. The kind that twisted in my chest like a blade. "You need to mind your own damn business, Scott," she said, her voice dripping with contempt, before disappearing into the bathroom. That single sentence sent a cold shock through me. Mind my own business, about a pregnancy note on her calendar? My stomach twisted, that sickening kind of dread settling in. It felt like standing on the edge of a shaky scaffold, knowing damn well the fall was coming, but not knowing just how far I was about to drop. I was still trying to wrap my head around Rachel's icy dismissal when I found it. A crumpled slip of paper wedged behind the microwave. Normally, I wouldn't be poking around back there, but I'd bumped the damn thing while making coffee and heard the faint rustle of something slipping. Figuring it was just a grocery list or an old receipt, I fished it out. It was a receipt, all right. But not for something simple. A high-end dinner, steaks, wine, and dessert for two. The date? Last Saturday. The same Saturday she'd told me she was buried in work at the clinic. My heartbeat slammed in my ears. Rachel and I hadn't had a nice dinner together in months. Hell, she barely looked at me across the table most nights. She was always on about how tight money was, making sure I knew just how much of a burden I'd become since my back injury. So tell me, who the hell was paying for that meal? And, more importantly, who the hell was she sharing it with? My hands trembled as I stared at the receipt, the words swimming in front of me. A single, gut-wrenching question pounded through my skull. How blind have I been? I tucked the paper into my pocket, swallowing the urge to storm into the bathroom and demand answers. No, not yet. Not until I had a clearer picture of just how deep this went. So, for the first time in my life, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I started looking. I rifled through the glove compartment in her car, checked the trunk, even dug into the pockets of her lab coats. It made my skin crawl, digging through her things like a man without trust, but deep down, I already knew. Rachel had already crossed that line. I was just catching up. And I didn't have to search long before the pieces started stacking up. Receipts for lunches she never mentioned. A tiny bottle of men's cologne tucked into the side pocket of her purse. My throat went dry. There was no way in hell I could brush this off as nothing. At the same time, Rachel wasn't even bothering to be subtle anymore. She came home with fresh stories about urgent, last-minute procedures that conveniently cropped up every single time I tried to talk to her. One night, she strolled in after midnight wearing brand new shoes I knew she never bought while we were out together. When I asked where they came from, she just scoffed, like I was a complete fool for even asking. The next morning, she accused me of overstepping, for having the audacity to ask about her schedule. It was a shift so cold, so calculated, that it hit me like a gut punch. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was just some unwanted presence in my own damn house. Then her parents called. Cheerful. Excited. Asking how I felt about some big blessing. Apparently, Rachel had dropped hints that they might be grandparents sooner than they thought. I felt my mouth go dry, my tongue like sandpaper. I managed to mumble something about not being sure yet, even though the very idea made my stomach churn. Their enthusiasm only made my dread worse. Because if Rachel was pregnant, how the hell could it be mine? We hadn't been close in 8 months. Not once. Not even an accidental brush of intimacy. And yet, here she was, letting her church-going parents believe this was some divine miracle. I felt like the air had been sucked from the room, like I was suffocating under the weight of a realization I didn't want to face. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was how damn smart Rachel was about it. She wasn't just cheating, she was weaponizing her parents' faith to shield herself. And if she was planning to pass off this baby as mine, what else was she capable of? I needed answers. But I knew Rachel, knew the way her mind worked. If I confronted her now, she'd dig in her heels, twist the truth until I was the villain, and make sure I walked away feeling like the bad guy. So I played along. I smiled weakly when her parents dropped by. I acted clueless whenever Rachel flaunted her long hours and dodged my questions. But deep down, I was taking notes. Locking in every lie. Because I wasn't about to be blindsided again, that I was just biding my time, waiting for the moment I'd crack this whole thing wide open. Because if Rachel thought she could keep me in the dark, she'd seriously underestimated the man she was toying with. A few days later, she waltzed through the front door in an unusually good mood, humming to herself as she flipped through patient files. The shift was so jarring that it took me a second to process. Just the night before, she had snapped at me for forgetting to unload the dishwasher, throwing out some insult about my incompetence. And now? She was practically glowing. I had a sick feeling I knew why. Her sudden burst of happiness didn't come from a productive workday, it came from whoever she was sneaking around with behind my back. I played along. Need help with those? I asked, gesturing toward her files. She shot me this strange little smirk, like she was humoring a child, and said, "I've got it. Don't strain yourself, Mr. Bad Back." That jab stung, but I let it roll off me. If Rachel thought I was just some clueless, washed-up ex-construction worker, she had another thing coming. I spent years remodeling old houses, learning how to peel back walls and check every hidden pipe before the real work could begin. And right now? I was already knee-deep in my own renovation project, piecing together every bit of evidence without tipping her off. That night, I finally decided to make my move. She announced she had an emergency orthodontic procedure at 8 p.m. Right. Because dentists in this town were known for handling late-night crises. She said it so casually, as if daring me to question it. I didn't. Instead, I waited until she left, then grabbed my keys and tailed her from a safe distance. She drove nearly 30 minutes out, not toward her clinic, but to a swanky, upscale neighborhood. I parked a block away and watched as she pulled up to a sleek, modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm, creeping closer once she disappeared inside. A shadow flickered in an upstairs window. Then the lights clicked on, and I finally saw who she had gone to meet. Jason. Her ex-colleague. The name hit me like a slap. Rachel had mentioned him years ago, always brushing him off as too ambitious for his own good. I never got the impression that they were close. But clearly, she had left out a few details. Because the way they looked at each other through that window? That wasn't just two colleagues reviewing patient charts. Heat surged through my veins, my first instinct screaming at me to storm up to the door and call them both out. But the rational part of me, the part that knew concrete needs a solid foundation before you start pouring, forced me to hold back. I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. Not just a gut feeling. So I waited. I stood there in the shadows, jaw clenched, watching as the hours crept by. When Rachel finally stepped out, there was a smug satisfaction in the way she carried herself. Like a woman who had everything exactly where she wanted it. My pulse thundered with anger, but I forced it down, keeping myself out of sight as she drove away. The moment she played her hand. By the time I got home, my head was spinning, my thoughts a tangled mess of betrayal and cold, hard facts. And then, before I even had the chance to gather myself, she blindsided me again. "We need to talk," she announced as soon as I walked in. For a brief, fleeting second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she was going to confess. That she'd tell me the truth. That she'd admit she was carrying Jason's child. Instead, she hit me with something completely different. "I want you to move your fishing gear out of the garage. Make room for my new shelves. I'm sick of the clutter." I just stared at her. She met my gaze, calm as could be, like we were discussing storage space instead of the wreckage of our marriage. Like the baby, the lies, the deception, all of it, was just a footnote compared to her sudden need for extra shelving. I studied her face, searching for some flicker of guilt. Some sign that she felt even a shred of remorse. Nothing. Not a damn thing. It was like she was daring me to challenge her. So I swallowed down the anger, nodded once, and played along. "Sure," I said. But inside? I was bristling. Because this wasn't just disrespect. This was war. Not only was she lying about her late-night shifts, but now she was openly dismissing the one thing that still brought me peace, my passion, like it was just clutter to be tossed aside. And as if that wasn't enough, the very next morning, Rachel insisted we go to church with her parents. I knew better than to refuse. So I sat through the whole charade, gritting my teeth as she put on a performance so nauseatingly sweet it made my skin crawl. She clung to my arm, smiled like we were the picture of marital bliss, and even leaned in to whisper, "We're both thrilled about the future." I forced a polite smile, but inside, my stomach churned. Her mother kept sneaking glances at Rachel's stomach, her eyes shining with that unmistakable kind of hopeful excitement. And then came the hints. "God works in mysterious ways," she mused, practically glowing. Meanwhile, Rachel's father, a man so stone-faced I had never seen him so much as crack a joke, was suddenly all handshakes and warm welcomes, acting like we were bonded by some divine plan. I sat there, trapped in the middle of the world's most twisted play. Laying the trap. That afternoon, I told Rachel I was heading out to fish. But instead of driving to the lake, I made my way back to the glass house. If she was bold enough to meet Jason again, I wanted the evidence to prove it. I parked down the street, far enough not to be noticed, and snapped a few discreet photos, Rachel's car sitting pretty in the driveway. As I stared at those images, my hands shook, not with fear, not even with heartbreak, but with the kind of anger that simmers so deep it turns ice cold. If she thought she could parade me around as the proud father-to-be while sneaking off to another man's house, she was in for a hell of a reckoning. I just didn't realize how much bigger this was about to get. Or how messy my revenge would become once I had every last piece in place. The final pieces fall into place. 1 week later, Rachel strutted into the living room, all smiles, and dropped a pamphlet into my lap. I glanced down, my jaw tightening as I read the title. "Preparing for Your Bundle of Joy." I stared at the glossy cover, my gut twisting into knots. This was it. No heartfelt announcement. No honest conversation. No moment of truth. Just this. A blatant, shameless invitation to play along in the biggest lie of my life. When I looked up, Rachel was watching me, her eyes sharp with silent dare. I kept my voice neutral, flipping through the pages like I wasn't already piecing together the truth. "So, is this for your clinic? Or for us?" She let out a little laugh, empty and hollow. "Stop asking silly questions. You'll come, we'll do the couple activities. End of discussion." Then she turned on her heel and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me sitting there with a clenched jaw and fists so tight my knuckles ached. If this baby was Jason's, she was doing a damn good job making me play the part of the happy, devoted father. And worse? Her parents were eating it up. I knew it was only a matter of time before they started planning baby showers and baptisms, inviting half the town to celebrate this so-called miracle. Meanwhile, Rachel was reveling in all the attention, the perfect little actress playing her biggest role yet. The camera that sealed her fate. At this point, I was desperate for hard proof, evidence so undeniable that even Rachel wouldn't be able to weasel her way out of it. That's when I called up Dean. An old fishing buddy. Someone I trusted. We had known each other back when I was still hauling lumber, climbing scaffolds, before my back went to hell. He swung by under the excuse of planning a fishing trip in the mountains. But over stale coffee in my garage, now crammed with Rachel's damn shelves while my gear sat shoved in a corner, I laid it all out. The late-night clinic shifts that didn't add up. The crumpled receipt for that fancy dinner. The men's cologne that didn't belong to me. The pregnancy that couldn't possibly be mine. Dean listened, his face growing darker with each detail. Finally, he let out a low whistle and rubbed his temples. "Scott, man. This is insane. Have you confronted her yet?" I shook my head. "Not directly. If I just start throwing accusations, she'll twist it around, make me look like the bad guy. I need rock-solid proof." Dean nodded slowly, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small, discreet camera. The kind you could install without anyone noticing. He set it on the table between us. Place this in your house. She might slip up when she's on the phone. Or if Jason stops by. I stared at it, my stomach churning. It felt like something out of a spy movie. But this wasn't a movie. And I was past the point of moral hesitation. Rachel had already rewritten the rules of our marriage. Now, it was my turn to play the game. If she thought she could pin another man's baby on me, then I had every damn right to gather evidence. I installed the camera behind a row of old, dust-covered trophies from my younger days, making sure the angle captured both the living room and the front door. If Rachel was bold enough to play me for a fool, I was about to turn the tables. Caught in the act. A few nights later, Rachel came waltzing in at nearly 2 a.m. Her red lipstick was smeared, her hair a tousled mess. She looked smug. Triumphant. Like someone who had just won. I lay on the couch, pretending to be asleep. Through half-lidded eyes, I watched as she stopped by the hallway mirror, tilting her head, studying her reflection. Then she smirked. And whispered under her breath, "Got you exactly where I want you." My pulse pounded. Who the hell was she talking about? Jason? Me? Both of us? The next morning, after Rachel left for work, I retrieved the camera's memory card. I plugged it in, my stomach twisting with unease. And sure enough, the audio picked up her late-night phone call. Jason's name wasn't mentioned outright, but I didn't need it spelled out. Her words were faint but clear enough. "Yes, the church folks think it's his baby. Isn't that hilarious?" A sharp, cruel laugh. Then, with an edge of satisfaction, she added. "He still believes I'm building shelves at the office. God, he's clueless." A pause. Then. "If I can squeeze his signature on the final loan for the clinic, I'll be set. No matter how this pregnancy turns out." My vision blurred. She wasn't just cheating. She was using me. Not just as some gullible cover story, but to secure money, wringing me dry for her business. And worse? She thought it was funny. Like I was nothing more than some pathetic idiot she could manipulate at will. Rage surged through me, hot and sharp, but beneath it was something colder. Something almost calculating. Maybe now, I had enough. Enough proof. Enough leverage. Enough to bring her whole sick little game crashing down. Final confirmation, the DNA test. A few days later, Rachel strutted into the living room with an air of self-importance and announced she'd be flying out to a dentistry conference in Denver. She made sure to put on a performance in front of her parents, gushing about how the trip was crucial for learning about cutting-edge equipment. Her mother practically beamed with pride, soaking up every word. I just smiled and nodded, playing the loyal husband, the perfectly fooled husband. Inside, though, my fury coiled tighter, colder, deadlier. Because I had already checked the conference website. The dates didn't match. Rachel wasn't going to a conference. So I called in a favor from Dean. Dean had connections. A way of sniffing out the truths that people wanted buried. And sure enough, within hours, he had the real answer. Rachel wasn't headed to some high-tech dental seminar. She was checking into a luxury resort just outside Denver. Secluded cabins. Spa packages. Not exactly a hub for continuing education. Dean and I pooled some cash, and I booked a room in a modest motel down the road. Then, fueled by coffee and cold, unshakable purpose, I drove through the night. I arrived just after noon. And there it was, Rachel's sedan sitting pretty in the resort's parking lot. And parked right beside it? Jason's sleek silver coupe. My hands clenched around the steering wheel. For a brief moment, all I saw was red. I wanted to storm in there. Tear through that damn lobby. Drag them both out by their collars. But I forced myself to stay calm. Stay methodical. So I waited. Watched. And soon enough, there they were, Rachel and Jason, strolling across the resort grounds like a couple on vacation. Arms intertwined. Laughing. Completely at ease. Completely oblivious to the fact that I was watching. I followed them at a distance, the anger simmering low and steady in my chest. And then I heard it. The final straw. Jason's voice, low and smug. Once Scott signs the loan, I'll have every advantage, with or without him. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just an affair. This was a setup, this wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated scheme, a plan to string me along, use me as a financial pawn, and then toss me aside once her clinic was thriving. And she wasn't even ashamed of it. I listened as she laughed about it with Jason, cracking jokes about how gullible her parents were, eating up the sweet little family fairy tale she'd spun for them. That was the final push I needed. For the next 2 days, I gathered everything. Snapshots of them holding hands outside the spa. A recording of their voices through a half-open window, their words clear enough to make my blood boil. Dinner reservations. Times. Dates. All of it. By the time I hit the road back home, I had enough evidence to bury them both. But I wasn't ready to make my move just yet. Because there was still one last test that would bring this whole house of lies crashing down. The final showdown, exposing the truth. Rachel strolled back into the house 3 days later, dragging her suitcase behind her like she had actually been attending seminars all day. She sighed dramatically, rubbing her neck. "You wouldn't believe how exhausting this trip was," she said, tossing out some nonsense about learning new endodontic techniques. I barely heard her. All I could focus on was the glow in her cheeks. The smugness in her expression. The way she carried herself like someone who had won. She thought she had pulled off the perfect con. And maybe, for now, she had. But every triumphant smirk she threw my way only stoked the fire inside me. Because I wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. I was preparing to destroy her lie, in the one place she'd never dare let it unravel. The church. The same church she had used as a shield to sell her miracle baby story. The same church her parents worshipped in every Sunday. The same church that would witness the truth. The moment of truth. The following Sunday, Rachel insisted on taking Hazel to her parents' church for the baby's first blessing. A huge event in their religious circle. I acted the part, nodding along, letting her believe I was playing the dutiful, clueless husband. When she said I should just meet them there, I agreed without hesitation. Rachel probably thought she'd won. She had no idea what was coming. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the church was packed. The congregation was gathered, voices raised in hymns, all eyes on Rachel. She stood at the front, soaking up the attention, receiving handshakes, congratulations, praise. Her parents beamed with pride. The perfect picture of a happy, blessed family. I took a deep breath, feeling the envelope press against the inside of my jacket. My pulse pounded as I stepped through the doors. I walked straight down the aisle. Toward her. The pastor greeted me with warmth, arms outstretched, inviting me into the moment. I smiled back. And then, the pastor gestured for me to speak. To thank the congregation for their prayers. To honor this so-called miracle. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped up to the podium. Pulled out the envelope. My voice wavered just slightly as I started. "First, I want to thank you all for praying for my family. I know many of you consider this baby a miracle." I let the words settle. Let the weight of the moment hang. Rachel's eyes locked onto mine. Something flickered there, fear, realization. She knew. I took a slow breath. Then, with the entire congregation watching, I said, "But there's something you need to know." The color drained from Rachel's face. Her father stiffened, brows knitting in confusion. A hush spread through the church. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the DNA results, and unfolded them with deliberate care. Then, in the calmest voice possible, I read the words aloud. "According to this official paternity test, Hazel isn't mine." A ripple of stunned gasps swept through the room. Rachel's mother's hymn book slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The pastor's face went pale. Rachel sputtered, stepping forward. But I was done playing her game. The truth laid bare. "Scott, what are you?" I lifted a hand, cutting her off. "I've got proof of who the real father is. And it sure as hell isn't me." I turned to Rachel's father. His face had gone an alarming shade of red. For a long moment, the church was silent. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on everyone in that room. Then I spoke again, my voice steady. "For months, I kept quiet. Even when Rachel tried to pin this child on me, I held my tongue. But I won't do it anymore." I set the envelope down on the podium. Inside was everything. Photos. Statements. Timelines. And the cold, undeniable truth written in black and white. The hush of worship cracked into stunned whispers, then outright murmurs of shock and outrage. Rachel's parents turned to her, their faces etched with betrayal. Rachel stood motionless, as if she had just been turned to stone. Gone was her usual sarcasm, her usual sharp-tongued retorts. She just stood there, mouth open, eyes wide, silent. Somewhere in the background, Hazel let out a small cry at the rising commotion. But Rachel didn't even look at her own child. I forced myself to meet the pastor's gaze. The poor man looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. I exhaled sharply and said, "I'm sorry to drop this bombshell on everyone. But I refuse to be paraded around like a fool any longer." With that, I turned on my heel. And walked straight out of the church. The aftermath. Outside, the morning sun was blindingly bright. But for the first time in months, I breathed in the fresh air and felt lighter. A moment later, shouts erupted from inside. Rachel's father's voice boomed, his rage echoing through the church walls. Someone else gasped, "Oh my Lord." I could picture it, Rachel scrambling to spin this. Trying to salvage whatever was left of her perfect little narrative. But there was no coming back from a lie this big. Not after it had been exposed in front of the very people who had believed in it the most. Her devout family. Her friends. Half the damn town. It was over. A clean break. Rachel called me dozens of times in the days that followed. Every call rang unanswered. She even left a voicemail, her voice shaking with rage. "You ruined my life, Scott. You'll regret this. And if you don't sign that damn loan, I'll." I didn't bother listening to the rest. I just laughed. She still thought she could threaten me? Manipulate me? Not anymore. She had lost. Heavy checkmark the clinic funding. Heavy checkmark her parents' respect. Heavy checkmark the credibility she built around her so-called miracle. And me? I filed for divorce immediately. A couple of friends offered me a place to crash while I packed up my gear. So I didn't waste a second. I had spent too long living under the same roof as someone who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone. Not anymore. Now, I'm finalizing the last details of our legal separation. And I plan to move a few towns over. Where the trout streams run colder. And the memories are fewer. Final words. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Never underestimate how far someone will go to take advantage of your trust. And if you ever find yourself in my position, Heavy checkmark, gather your proof. Heavy checkmark, wait for the perfect moment. Heavy checkmark, then take your shot. Because sometimes the sweetest victory comes from exposing a lie in front of the very people who believed it was holy truth. Good riddance, Rachel. I'm walking away with my head held high. And that's more than she can ever claim.